Hello, hi Debs.
Hi everyone. So first of all, just checking that you can all hear me okay. Hopefully there's no sort of feedback issues or anything. I'd like to welcome you to What It Takes to Overcome Imposter Syndrome. This is the first online panel event of 2022 and the third event in the 22-23 What It Takes Alumni Speaker Series organised by the Alumni Relations team. So to introduce myself, my name is Dr. Deborah Husbands, and I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Westminster. I'm the co-chair for the BME Network, and I lead the Black History Year programme. I'm also an alumnus of the university, and I graduated in 2009 with a first-class honours degree in psychology. I then went to complete a PGCHE, that's a teaching qualification, and then a PhD in the experiences of minoritized students in higher education. Some of the participants in my study spoke about their experiences of imposterism, and it was that piqued my interest in the phenomenon. So just some housekeeping before I proceed. The talk is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the Alumni YouTube channel very soon. We'll send you the link to the channel and some useful resources in a follow-up email after this event. Your cameras and microphones are automatically turned off, but the live chat is on, and the group chat is there for you to ask questions to our speakers. We'll collate your questions throughout the talk via the group chat, and I'll put these to the panel after the main discussion. And even though live chat is on, the live recording, which ends up on YouTube, won't pick up any of your usernames or the chat, so you can have some confidence there. Please do bear with us if we experience any connection issues, but hopefully we'll be fine. So the discussion will cover the following themes. First of all, the panel will explore definitions of imposter syndrome, and that's also known as the imposter phenomenon. Sometimes it's called imposterism. The popular term is imposter syndrome. And we'll also talk about some of the common triggers for it, as well as discussing their experiences of facing it in the workplace or in higher education. We'll then tap into what our panel has learned about their experiences, and I'll invite them to share some practical skills, some tips, and some advice that they've implemented to help them build confidence and resilience when they're faced with challenges. And then we'll share some useful resources before we have the Q&A. And as I said, those resources will be shared with you in a follow-up email. So now to introduce our panel. So first of all, we have Carl Donaldson. Welcome, Carl. And Carl is a manager employment trainer at Wipers Youth. Carl has been a youth practitioner for over 25 years. He's dedicated to supporting young people and helping them use creative media to find their voices. Carl studied a BSc in psychology here at Westminster, graduating in 2019. Next, we have Natasha Ramachandran, and Natasha is a current PhD student at Westminster. Natasha's research investigates the transition between sleep and wakefulness, with a focus on the methodology that uses salivary hormones. So really interesting research there. She also has nearly a decade of teaching experience with the psychology department. And finally, we have Karen Bradshaw, OBE, who is currently the Chief Executive Officer at the Charity Finance Group. Since completing her LLB at Westminster in 1993, Karen has built up a wide array of experience across charity, regulation, law, policy, member support, and professional ethics. She's been recognized for several awards in the charity and finance sectors, and most recently, Karen was honored with an OBE for her services to charity in the New Year's Honours List in 2021. So I'm going to start by asking each of our panel members to give a very brief overview of their careers and their journeys from studying at Westminster until now. I'll start with Carl. So you're muted, Carl. I can't hear you at the moment.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Since leaving uni, I'll just put it out there as well. There are nerves, this whole imposter thing. A lot of it came up while I was doing this, because again, I'm like, well, there is an element of imposterism while I'm doing this, but we'll get into that. But since leaving uni, I've been working with Wipers for the last 6 years. During that time, I've gone on to sort of like do employment education and training, and also Be Intrinsic is sort of like something on the side which came up during lockdown, and which I'm developing more again about people, creative writing, and express. I don't know why I get so nervous. Deepest apologies. It's just that I'm looking at a screen. I can only see Debbie and a few faces, and I know there's a lot of people on, so it's almost like trying to blank that out and still talk. But yeah, the journey's been good. I'm currently working with young people at the minute. I'm trying to create real life work experiences for them. So putting them in environments and helping them manage their emotions while they're in there. And then we get in placements after. So that's currently what I'm doing. And we're starting a project in January where we're going to sort of like help young people get into sort of like mentoring. So it's mentoring mentors. Yeah, so that's what I'm currently doing.
Thank you very much. So that's a nice brief overview. And I'll turn to Natasha next. So what's your story?
Hi, Deb. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity today to share my experiences. I started at Westminster University as a psychology undergrad in 2008, I think it was, which then resulted in me just falling in love with the degree, and it opened doors to me then starting a PhD, which I started with EDEBS, and it's been a long time coming. I've been in this PhD for about 10 years part-time, as well as teaching, and I'm soon to submit my thesis, hopefully in the next few months. So that's where I am now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Congratulations as well on getting this far in the journey.
And
thank you for your brevity there. And now to Karen.
Hi, Carl, I feel just the same as you. Every time we start doing something like this, my nerves come into my stomach, into the mouth. So completely with you there. I'm just going to start a little bit before my degree actually, and just say that I failed my A-levels, and I think that's important because it will possibly come up in the conversation. So I was a year later having to resit my A-levels, joining the degree, and as you said, I qualified I graduated in 1993, and then I did a bar vocational course, which again may come up in the conversation because halfway through that course I suddenly realised I didn't want to be a barrister. If this was what being a barrister was, I didn't want to do it. So from that complete change of career, I've then spent 16 years working in a professional body for accountants before becoming the chief executive of the current organisation, which blends charity and finance together.
Thank you so much. So lots of really interesting things, I think, in your stories, and I'm going to pick some of that apart now, but from the perspective of your lived experiences of facing the imposter syndrome. We'll use the term that's in popular use, the syndrome. I should actually add, and I think it's useful to say, that this term originated in 1978 from some seminal research that was done by Pauline Clance and I can't remember, I think Sue Ines. In this research, they looked at the experiences of professional working white women. I don't think they looked at doctoral students at that time. What they found was that these students, these professional women were sort of really high-flying women doing really, really well. And yet for some reason, they felt as if they were a fraud, an intellectual fraud in their environments, and that at some point someone was going to find them out, and they'd be thrown out of their, whatever it was they were doing, whatever professional capacity. And it was around that point that the term imposter phenomenon was born. It later kind of migrated to something that we call imposter syndrome. But there is some resistance to using the term syndrome because that has kind of connotations with some kind of medical condition. You talk about a syndrome as part of a constellation of diseases, perhaps, and it's not. So we're trying to resist attempts to pathologize the notion of imposter syndrome and just really see it for what it is. Okay. So I'm going to ask some general questions, and I'll just sort of pick on you randomly if you don't mind. So my first question, and I'm going to put that to Natasha. When did you first become aware of the term imposter syndrome?
Well, I think I overheard it a number of times when I first started the PhD, because it's quite a familiar thing PhD students talk about, the feeling of being an imposter and not sitting quite right in a department and not fully in with themselves. But I didn't understand it. So I think when I say discover the term, that's when I discovered the term, but understanding it came much later.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So if I was to put that same question then to you, Karen, when did you first become aware of the term imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I guess for me, it was probably during my first leadership stroke management role, in talking to particularly other women, about that sort of sense of being found out, not feeling that I was good enough. And when you talk to other people in a similar position, you start to realize that actually you're not alone, that literally everyone of all genders, all ethnicities, everyone feels at some point that they are not quite enough. And so I can't remember exactly when I put the label on it, but certainly I was talking about that feeling of being an imposter, right at that first sort of management stroke leadership piece.
Thank you. And that's quite interesting, actually, because the research shows us that although there's been a tendency to link the imposter phenomenon or syndrome with the experiences of women and girls, that men experience it too. And so, Carl, what do you have to say about that? When did you first feel like you experienced the feeling of being an imposter?
Do you know, even coming up to this, I've always felt like that. And when I found out or I heard it, it sort of like validated what I'd been feeling before, if that made sense. So I had feelings of imposter syndrome before I knew the term. And when I found out the term was 2017, doing a module, like some research, whatever, and I came across it, it's like when you hear a label and it fits, it's like, yeah. So I adopted it, if that makes sense. So it was something I always felt throughout my life journey and my school journey. But when I found the name, it was like, yeah, that validated what it was. That makes sense?
Yes, it absolutely does. And it's quite interesting in some recent research that we've carried out that students in that study talked about taming my imposter. So it's the idea of something that you live with and you've got to manage this thing like the beast in the room. So if we think of the imposter syndrome as something that could potentially affect a person's mental health or career, looking back, are there things that you might have said or done differently if you hadn't felt like an imposter? So I want to put that question to Karen. And Karen, you've just disappeared off my screen for a second. So I'm hoping you're still in the room.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
I'm here. I'm here.
Right, thank you. So yeah, I'll just repeat the question. So given that we understand that the imposter syndrome has the capacity to affect a person's mental health or to affect their career, looking back, are there things that you might have said or done differently if you hadn't felt like an imposter, do you think?
Oh, hundreds. But the one that I think I'm going to share with you, because I think it illustrates so much how this can impact you negatively from a well-being point of view was, as in my current role, CEO, we had a big issue bubble up to the surface, and it broke me. I literally had what you would call a breakdown. I was off work for the best part of 3 months. It took me a long time to get back in. But when I think about the words that we associate with it, if I look at things like the characteristics of being a Superman or a Superwoman, you know, that sort of feeling that I'm the only one that can resolve this, which in some regards makes you wrestle with your ego. You know, there is a big piece of ego in this. And I think we tend to think of ego as being a negative thing. And I remember one of my coaches saying to me, why do you continuously say to that sort of monster on your shoulder that you call your ego, go away, leave me alone, rather than saying, thank you for pointing out how I feel, and I've got this. You know, thanks for reminding me I've got this. Why are you so cruel to this part of you? Because it's that part of you that enables you to stand on a platform in front of 800 people and deliver a keynote speech. You know, that's my ego, but that ego also weighs me down, and it breaks me sometimes. It breaks me mentally. It makes me feel like, gosh, I just can't live up to what I think I'm expecting of myself and what I think others are expecting of me. So there is that sort of fear of failure, discounting everything that you do and thinking that it's not good enough. And the other example I would give of it is, and this is perhaps something that all of us can relate to, when you get feedback or evaluation, whether it's because you've spoken and someone's marked you or it's a piece of work that you get back, you will look at the negative comments first, 100%. And even if you don't look at the negative comments first, it will be, you could have 10s all the way through and your face will go straight to the one. And it's that bit that sticks in you and hangs on you like a weight on your shoulders.
Totally. I think you've really summed up what it feels like to experience that syndrome. And as you say, that negative kind of rhetoric that you keep rehearsing, you know, even though all of the external evidence shows that you're more than capable. So I want to talk about, I'm going to go to Natasha here. And obviously, you know, you're a PhD researcher, you're a scientist. In terms of your own experience, what are the kind of common triggers that made you realize, actually, I'm experiencing the imposter syndrome here? What were the triggers?
You know, I found this one of the most challenging questions, actually, when I was trying to prepare for this. And actually, what I had to do is I had to take myself back. And it's the fact that I not only did my BSc at the University of Westminster, I jumped from BSc to PhD. From BSc, where I had seminar leaders and lecturers, I went to PhD and then eventually became a seminar leader and lecturing. My seminar leaders became my peers, my lecturers became my peers. That was a huge trigger, and that triggered I think it was incredibly rewarding, but that was very much a trigger for what on earth am I doing here? Have I done enough? You're around rooms with a room with such vast knowledge, and suddenly you're having conversations with people who are just so within their field, and I'm just starting off. And Karen mentioned an element of fear of failure, and I have had failure through life, whether it's failing a past degree. And one of those triggers comes with being a child of immigrants. I feel that my parents have had this notion of, well, you should be absolutely grateful for the education you receive and the achievements you experience, as opposed to pride. And I very much felt that failure when I actually failed my first initial degree that I started. And I felt that I let down so many people, and that fear of failure actually has followed and has fed through to this imposter syndrome that I felt during the time of PhD. So yeah, I would say fear of failure, and by all means being in a room with such big brains.
I can relate to that. So, you know, what's interesting here is that you've mentioned some of the internal triggers, and you've also talked about external triggers, so the environment. And I want to ask you, Carl, are there external factors, so things that are beyond your control, that you think might have caused you to feel like an imposter?
Definitely, definitely. I think the things outside of my control is how I believe I'm perceived by people. Yeah, so there was always that fear of failure. A lot of what Natasha and Karen said is that failure, like just it's nothing, because it's like I got expelled from school. So my year was the GCSEs. We done coursework, which I handed in, but lo and behold, you know, naughty Carl, yeah, I got kicked out basically. So I didn't get a chance to do my exams. Yeah, so everyone else done that. So everything was almost like, it was almost like that self-fulfilling prophecy. I was a bad kid in school, didn't do my exams, and I come out with nothing. So it's like, right, education ain't for me. So it was almost like that carried on. So I never really felt positive. I've done a lot of things, but it was almost like a mask, because that wasn't the real self, if that makes sense. So it was like there was a lot of that fear of failure. If I don't do it, then I won't fail. And when I'm not doing it, I feel like I should be doing more. So it's almost like it was kind of like, it was difficult, but you find coping mechanisms. And with that, when you talk about mental health and stuff, when you find these coping strategies, they may not be the right ones, but you get used to it. So when you're around people and they say, well, someone might say, at one point, it's like, oh yeah, you've got a lot of issues. And I'm like, no, I'm fine. But they could see it, I couldn't see it. So it's almost like putting on a mask. And when people pick it out, it sort of like reinforces that imposter thing. That makes sense? Yeah.
Yes,
So,
it does.
come.
Thank you. So I'm just thinking about staying within external factors for a while. And I'm going to turn to you, Karen, because, you know, you've got a really, what I'd say is a full-on profile, and potentially somebody who's very much in the public eye. You know, just think of people with the OBE. Once you've got the OBE, it means, you know, like you're kind of like forever out there, and everybody's following your every move. And I suppose one of the factors of our times is the effect of social media on, you know, a person's persona, perception of self, and so on. What's your view about social media? Do you think it has it's had a positive or a negative impact on the construction of, you know, being an imposter in your own life? And can you say a little bit more about, you know, if it's not had, why, or if it has, why?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer for me is probably both. I think it's had both a positive and a negative impact. And I think just picking up something that Carl was saying, it was really resonating with me there. I think for everyone, there are the stories that we tell ourselves, and there are the stories that other people tell us. And I think actually a lot of the imposter syndrome that I've witnessed people experience has been as a result of prejudice and disadvantage, and society expecting and shaping our reactions in ways that shouldn't be shaped. You know, there are ways in which I think we talk to people and about people that in inverted commas keep them down, you know, squash them. And I think that plays really heavily to imposter syndrome, because Carl described himself as a naughty boy. You know, if we tell people that they're a naughty boy, they'll believe it at some point. If we tell someone, I remember my head of sixth form telling me that I shouldn't resit my A-levels, that I wasn't academic and I probably ought to just go and work in a bank. You know, so if I'd listened to that, as opposed to feeling and listening to my parents and my peers who were saying, you can do this, you've always wanted to do this, get on and do it, that would have squashed me completely. So I think there is a combination, and social media, I think, is just an intense form of lens of the same thing. You get the polarized views, you get the people that continuously put you down and knock you and expect you to behave in certain ways. You know, how many times have you been told that you're too loud, you're too aggressive, you're not strategic enough, not this? You know, it's these sorts of squashing comments, and I think you get amplified through social media. But the flip side of that is you also get a great sense of community. And when you start talking to other people about their experiences and you start to see those patterns of behaviour, you can actually step back and say, no, this isn't imposter syndrome I'm feeling. I'm actually just responding emotionally to what is a crappy situation, you know, not a very pleasant position that I'm being put in. So I think there's something really interesting about that control piece and stories piece and that authenticity and vulnerability piece that I think is really plays very closely with what we call imposter syndrome or the imposter phenomenon.
Thank you. Really, really interesting insight there. So I'm going to do something which is slightly off record here. So this is not something that is part of our prep work for this talk, but I think it's really important that we address this because we've got an audience of, there's some staff, there are students, alumni. What role do you think the university environment plays in either encouraging the imposter syndrome or in enabling people to kind of manage or contain or completely get rid of the imposter syndrome? So we're going to start with you, Carl, because I'm going back to your kind of university experience. So what role do you think the university played in either helping or hindering the notion that you may have had of being an imposter?
Wow, you've only got an hour, so I think when I went back to uni, one of the things what I faced and I think I struggled with was being and what they call a mature learner, yeah, and going back into an environment where like I'm studying with people or younger people like the same age as my kids, yeah. So I had to come over that, and then going in and seeing the lecturers who are maybe older than some of them, yeah, and feeling like, okay, what I say, will they validate what I say because I'm older, or would they just put it aside as, well, you're done because I'm a lecturer? I did get a few, like when I say like the energy, I'm very about energy, and then I think why I ended up staying on and completing it was because in the beginning it was a bit difficult, but in the end, that's what kept me there. If that makes sense. So it was almost like I went from feeling like an imposter to having conversations, and I think it was important speaking to staff like yourself and Brian and Karen or whatever, and finding out that, okay, there's a lot in common, we have a lot of similarities, so I'm not that different, if that makes sense. And that's what gave me that sense of, okay, I can be here, I do know what I'm on about. Yes, I think that was a good thing. And I was different. A lot of the students, I realised they may not have had that rapport with staff. So when I was doing the student union, I heard a lot of, it ain't this and it ain't that. And I worked out that the expectations of younger students from staff, it wasn't quite what they wanted. So I always said, when they go in the first year, they need to have a sort of like, this isn't school, this isn't college, you've got to do for yourself, if that makes sense, which I don't think was a clear thing for a lot of them. But yeah, I think the more comfortable I became, the less I felt as an imposter, because I thought, yeah, I'm supposed to be here. I know my stuff, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. You've hit upon a really important point here in terms of research that's been carried out with the imposter phenomenon. And we're understanding that it's very strongly linked, correlated with feeling a sense of belonging, feeling like you fit in. And what you've just described is this process of, you know, perhaps starting with a feeling of belonging, being a mature student. And maybe we've got some mature students in the audience as well, and you might be struggling with the same kind of thing. But in your case, Carl, you've just explained that, you know, you started to kind of see the equivalences in your environment, and eventually you got to a place where you felt settled, you felt that you belonged, and that has a mediating or a moderating effect on the feeling of being an imposter. I want to ask the same question to you, Karen. So in terms of the university environment and for your experience, what role did it play in either kind of, you know, stoking the fires of imposterism or subduing them?
Well, I think what you've just said throws a great deal of light and understanding for me on why I found actually my 3 years of doing my degree were the time that I felt the least out of place. and I almost thought that I would feel completely out of place because I hadn't passed my A-levels the first time and I'd had to have another bite at it. But I felt like it was the right place for me, and I felt like I was doing for the first time something that really clicked for me. Plus, I had a lot of lecturers and peers that were very supportive and very encouraging of me. And for the first time, I felt like actually I was able to make contributions in a way that I didn't feel like I was being stupid. You know, that people were going, "Oh, that's an interesting point. Well done. Yeah, interesting. Expand on that." Whereas I felt completely dumb in my GCSE, well, O-levels, that ages me completely. O-levels and then into my A-levels, I felt completely out of my depth and completely unable to compete. So that makes a lot of sense for me. It was only when I stepped into the bar vocational course where I felt, from a class point of view, from a social economic point of view, I felt completely out of place, completely. And that played hugely, I think, to my decisions as to whether or not I wanted to carry on and be a barrister, because it just was a different world. It was, and I felt completely out of place.
Really interesting. And what you're saying there resonates as well with participants in a study that I've done with a colleague here at Westminster. And what the participants were saying was that for them, university saved them. This is the notion of coming into a world, the world of university, where everything is there's so many diverse people, neurodiversity reigns in this environment. So you're going to find people that are, you know, all kind of parts of the spectrum. There's everything here. And for some students, being in this environment and being able to see all of this going on was what actually saved them. So, you know, it's really interesting to hear you say that, because it really does resonate with what some of our participants said. And I'm going to finish by asking the same question to you, Natasha, before we move into the sort of part 2 of our talk. So in terms of the university environment, did it stoke your imposter or did it quell it?
Well, I think it's I feel the imposter syndrome developed over time. Unfortunately, it developed over time. And that was just simply due to the fact that I knew that I was incredibly different, being ethnicity, being even from the fact that I just jumped BSc to PhD. I was one of the few at the time. And I also knew I was incredibly different, even within my own research circle, in terms of backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. So I did walk in with a sort of blind side. I didn't really see what was going to develop, and I felt it slowly continue. However, what I have noticed in the last 2 years, that there is a lot more out there for students like myself to overcome it. And one of those things that, a project that I was involved in this year really brought it out of me. The University of Westminster collaborated with Brunel University and really wanted to delve into experiences of the researcher of colour in order to enhance their experiences. And interestingly enough, that brought out those feelings of imposter syndrome. And within that project, I was able to really home in on how I can overcome it. And actually part of that is why I'm sat here today, actually. So it's really very much a reflective project that I was part of, and I think it's developed over time. And yeah, so I'd definitely say it started off badly, but then as I've persevered, I've thought, right, okay, I've been given the opportunity to try and home it down.
Brilliant. So we've spent the sort of first half of this talk, if you like, just really focusing on the experience of imposterism, looking at some of the triggers, looking at some of the internal kind of factors that would create these feelings, a feeling of being, you know, kind of things are out of your control and so on, looking at the external environment. Now let's turn to some of the practical things that we can do to manage that. And I know that you've picked up on some of those things, but let's kind of just take a more explicit approach right now. So I'm going to ask you in turn to share with me any resources that may have helped you to manage the feeling of imposterism. And those resources could be books, they could be podcasts, it could be a YouTube videos, it could be a favorite auntie, whatever, or any therapies that you may have used or techniques. And we know that there's a lot more going on now in terms of mindfulness and meditation and just kind of being in the moment and, you know, managing your breath and finding different ways to manage anxiety and so on. So I'm going to ask you to share with me any of the practical skills, any of the tips and advice that you would give to others based on your own experience of these kinds of resources and techniques. And I'll start with Karen on this one.
Thanks. So the first thing I think is a lot about confidence. So and being able to lean into our confidence and not to think that it's something that's innate, that we always feel confidence. A friend of mine used to say to me that confidence was about the first three letters, C-O-N, con. You know, which I think it's quite an interesting thought. And then I like to read, but I also love watching TED Talks because I think they're easy to kind of just stick on there. 15 minutes, they're little bite sizes, they're quite provocative. And I came across this woman called Amy Cuddy, who is an American academic. She was very, very bright. She fitted in, and then she had this huge brain injury, and she had to literally learn everything all over again. And her power poses, you know, the sort of going into the number of toilets before interviews or difficult meetings, etc., that I've been stood in with my hands through the power pose for 5 minutes or whatever, or techniques of standing up when I'm having a difficult conversation on the telephone, so I feel physically in a better place. That was really super helpful. Brene Brown's work around vulnerability and authenticity and understanding that, you know, we all tell ourselves stories and then we look for evidence to support it, and we can be our worst critics. We can be the ones that cut ourselves off at the knees. So understanding how we interact with stuff and what the importance of vulnerability and authenticity are, you know, I thought that was really helpful. I came across this lady relatively recently, Brittany Packnett, who's again American, talks about confidence being the necessary spark before everything. And I think that's wonderful, you know, just to see that spark of change. And then there's this wonderful guy called Nick Vujicic, who is who does a lot of talk about, you know, overcoming. But I wanted to pick up something that Natasha said, because I think this is really important. For me, the biggest lesson for myself was not to try and see my difference as being something I had to overcome, but rather to celebrate what makes me me. And to the lady who's asked a question in the chat about to what extent do we help people fit in or you know, celebrate what makes us different, I personally think we should not be trying to make people fit in. I think we should be celebrating difference and removing the barriers to people being able to celebrate what makes them them, because you can only be successful if you're in flow, and you're only in flow when you're going with yourself, not against yourself. So that felt to me a really important part of it. I've got so many other things that I would say, but I don't want to hog the mic.
Thank you so much, Karen. And just a reminder to our audience that the resources that our speakers are referring to will be shared with you in an email that will be sent to all attendees after this talk. So you might be furiously trying to scribble down, you know, Brené Brown and, you know, Amy Cuddy, but you'll get all of those resources sent to you with links and so on. So thank you so much. I mean, this is really, really interesting. And, you know, listening to the personal stories of other people that have gone through adversity and how they've triumphed has a way of grounding us. What you're saying about the change from sort of having to fit in to simply belonging with your authentic self is something that has been also recognized in the literature and research. A lot of emphasis before on you've got to fit the mold, you've got to do all the things that make people like you, etc. Now it's actually about being true to yourself, being your credible, authentic self, and the rest of the world embracing that in whatever way it takes. Okay, in terms of resources, again, I'm going to kind of ask the same question to Carl. So Carl, what resources or techniques or therapies have you found helpful in managing the kind of experience of imposterism?
Right, I listen to a lot of stuff. Breanne Brown, Amy, yeah, they're sort of my go-to. Muji, Sadhguru, and these are just more, not to say that I used to listen to things and be like, I can't understand, it's not going through, it's not making sense. And I'm trying to listen to it so it could change X, Y, Z. But what I found is that when I put it on and somehow it just resonates, yeah, that's what I know, I'm in that flow. And a lot of my anxiety comes about not preparation. So I think like when I plan and I'm organized, I don't feel anxious about anything. If I've got to go and speak in front of strangers who I don't know, there's that anxiety of almost that imposter. Would I get found out? But a lot of what I do now is intrinsic. And I came across that word intrinsic, when I was studying it. It's like, that's the name of my company, Be Intrinsic. It's like when you're true to yourself, yeah, and you're actually as above what you're talking, you're living, there's no fear of imposterism. No one can't catch you out. So that's why now it's like, I don't put myself out as much and I don't celebrate success. So that come up, and I think again, it's like I've done a lot of things, but I don't talk about it because it's like, right, what's next? That's just my mind. It's like, so I won't sit there and say I've done this and done that, but in not doing that, people may see that as, oh, well, you're not really serious. That's my view. It might be like, well, you've done that, why didn't you follow that through? I mean, I've done a lot of things what I could go on about, but it's like not completing. I completed my degree. And when I completed my degree, I can tell you, it's almost like in my work and finishing, yeah, I start projects and I see them through, I do that. But when I completed my degree, I can say honestly, the first bit of work I've done in an institution, which was validated in that sense. And it took me to get to a certain age to get it. So it's only like now that I'm really living my truth and speaking it. If that makes sense, because before it was coming from a place of the mask on, what do you expect from me? So I can be different things to different people. But you lose yourself in that. And now that I'm actually where I am, I'm comfortable. I can talk to anyone anywhere. Just give me a little bit to warm up, like obviously. But yeah, once I'm warm, I could talk to anyone anywhere about anything because I'm speaking my truth, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is this kind of journey of embracing your authentic self and then taking all of your successes in your stride, so to speak. This is now a part of the new you. This is part of who you are. And celebrating our successes is really, really important. And as you said, Karen, like kind of beating yourself up where the ego sitting on the shoulder and saying all sorts of negative things. So our self-talk is so important for being able to kind of reconstruct a more positive sense of our identity. So there's lots of great questions coming in, and just before I go to some of these questions, I want to ask the same question to you, Natasha. So any resources that you've used, any therapies or techniques that you found effective in dealing with the feeling of imposterism?
Yes, absolutely. But before I quickly mention these resources, one thing I find quite striking right now is that I'm towards the end of this dark time of imposter syndrome. I'm just coming out of it. I'm noticing that I'm just coming out of this little stage here. And actually, it's been very much covered by trauma. And I'd say that very, easily now because I've had quite a lot of help with trauma recently. And that's been through therapy. And I attend weekly therapy sessions, and it's been incredibly helpful to, particularly they involve a bit of psychotherapy and a little bit of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, in which I have started to learn about my authentic self. Interestingly, I don't feel like I knew what my authentic self looked like. And that's probably what the main issue was in experiencing imposter syndrome. So therapy has it's helped me massively in starting the procedure of overcoming this imposter syndrome. Inclusive of therapy, I would say mindful running. So I always used to exercise, but now I've found mindful running, in which I'm very much, with myself and no music, which I find crazy. I never was able to run, without listening to something, but now it's very much being in the presence whilst running. And I notice whilst you're in that presence of physical exertion, well, the rest is absolutely easy when it comes to everyday life. And finally, journaling. So I've journaled throughout my life, funny enough, but I'm probably doing it a lot more now, just because I'm learning so much more about myself. So I'd say those are the 3 things that have really helped me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing them. And you just made me remember the fact that there is now a free gym, everyone. There's a free gym at Westminster. So if you fancy some mindful running on the treadmill, seriously, in terms of managing one's mental health, managing just physical health more generally, taking this kind of exercise and benefiting from the fact that it's free at Westminster, please do consider doing that as well. There's something that you said that made me think about this happening in stages, that there are times in our life when we will feel like we're an imposter, and other times where things might be kind of chugging along quite nicely, and then suddenly the imposter phenomenon sort of just looms, and then we have to kind of find ways of dealing with that. And as you said, there's sometimes a temptation to anesthetize ourselves from these things. So running with music or blocking it out, this is happening, but it's not real. I'll put it to one side. But facing your demons in some respects, facing the issue, is also an important way of managing it. And you've also mentioned therapy as being key to that. Often when I speak to people in the US, for example, everyone's having therapy over there, and I'm thinking, we actually need some of that here as well. But I'm going to turn to some questions, because we've got lots of great questions coming in, and we did have a comment as well, Carl, at one point where someone said they could really resonate with some of the things you were talking about in terms of your experience, because I'm guessing might be a mature student. So what I like about this is that from all sorts of walks of life and right across the lifespan, we're actually considering what the journey is like and what imposterism might feel like. So to some questions, and thank you very much everyone for sending them in. So the first one I'm going to take is from Rebecca. Thank you for that. So how much, and when I ask the question, I'm not necessarily going to ask any one of you to answer that. It's just if you feel that this is something you want to jump on, then please just answer the question. So how much should we be trying to help people to feel that they do fit in, as opposed to helping people to be proud of not being from the same background? So again, it sounds something here around recognizing differences, celebrating differences. Rebecca goes on to say it's a battle between fitting into the system versus eroding the system. She says, I didn't feel imposter syndrome as a mature student at Westminster, but working as a civil servant, let's kind of talking about the barrister experience there. Working as a civil servant in central government has been much more challenging as someone from a working class background. And Karen, maybe you might want to talk about this one. It just resonates with your experience. So is it about trying to help people to fit in? I think you've talked about that. You might want to expand on that. Or is it about, being just proud of who you are, regardless of your background, and recognizing that where intersectionality is such a key thing, we have so many multiple identities now. There's class, there's gender, there's ethnicity, there's age, there's ability. All of those things are in there in the mix. So Karen, what do you have to say about that?
Gosh, there is so much in that. I mean, the first thing I would say is that I think You can only change things if you can get in there, you know. And so sometimes there is an element of, I don't mean compromising our integrity, but playing the game, in inverted commas, to get ourselves in the room. And once we're in the room, we're able to then kick the door down and let others in, or, you know, smash through the glass ceiling and help people up, or whatever the analogy that you want to use. So I do think there is something about that. But I also think that increasingly we need to be true to ourselves and not necessarily fight to get into the rooms that are oppressing and prejudicial, and we're perpetuating those let's call it what it is: inherently racist organisations and institutions, inherently prejudicial, bigoted. You know, if we play the game, sometimes I think we perpetuate those narratives, and it doesn't help any of us. So it's a difficult one to say to what extent do you do it. I think we have to make our own judgments. I went for a job a few years back, and during the interview process, somebody said to me, you need to stop talking about love so much. And I thought, do you know what? I'm not going to stop talking about love, because love in leadership is something I'm really interested in. And if they don't want me to talk about love, if I get this job, I'm going to be the wrong person for this organisation, because that's exactly what I want to be doing. That's exactly what I want to be talking about. So I think we have to ask ourselves the questions, but I think we also should not be, once we are in a room, using our energies to help somebody else fit into a broken system. We should be using our energies to break the bloody system and get it back to being in the place where we can all feel in flow, and where we all can bring ourselves completely to our place to work. Because frankly, you spend so much time at work, we owe it to ourselves and each other to bring our whole selves and feel rewarded and recognised and seen for who we are.
Absolutely. Virtual round of applause there. I mean, that's a fantastic answer. Yeah, and what I wanted to do, I'm going to change tack slightly. So given that question, Karen, from Rebecca, what one resource, whether it's a technique or whether it's a kind of physical resource, would you suggest for Rebecca to help her to kind of ground herself in the situation in which she finds herself? Now I'm putting you on the spot here. I'm going a little bit off the agenda, but what one resource would you suggest for Rebecca, or technique?
I think I'm going to go with what came to me when you asked that, because I think often your reaction is that your first reaction might be the right one. There's a book that I absolutely adore. It's written in a very strange way. I don't think the author's first language is English, so the phrasing is quite different to what you might be used to. And it's called The Four Agreements, and it's by Don Marie Miguel. And I absolutely adore it because it's so simple. In a nutshell, without sort of being a spoiler alert, he talks about us being blank sheets, and we then take on board lots and lots of stories and societal norms that are unhealthy to us, and that he reckons there are 4 agreements that we should have with ourselves and with each other, and they are: be impeccable with your words, so say what you mean, speak with integrity, don't use your words to hurt people, don't make assumptions, so check everything that you say, because I think we're terrible at going, oh, you mean this, and you don't. Don't take anything personally, and this one was a real eye-opener for me, because you can hear the don't take the negative personally, but don't take the positive personally either, because it's just someone else's opinion and they might be blowing smoke proverbially up you. So and always do your best, but recognize that your best is not going to be the same when you're feeling good, when you're feeling put down, when you're feeling ill. These are going to be different ways, and you can only ever do your best. So as long as you are doing your best, you should not then go, but my best isn't good enough. Yeah. Who is the arbiter of what good enough is?
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning the 4 agreements, because I have that on an audio book. I'm going to go back to that. So excellent. So we've got some more questions coming in. The next question is, this is from Jane, and she was wondering if the panel could name things that you did to try and help yourselves, things that were helpful, or some things that might have even made the situation worse. So the things that you might avoid if you with hindsight. Okay, so Natasha, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Negative self-talk, that would probably be something I should have avoided. Being less compassionate to myself is something else I could have avoided. It feeds into every part of this. I call it a shadow. I'm relating imposter syndrome to a shadow of just sheer anxiety, actually. So I would say I had a tendency of negative self-talk. So I think for sure that's something I could have just cut out, stopped, and just felt a little bit more compassionate. Yeah, towards a lot, but mainly towards myself.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And what resource would you recommend to help someone who, because I'm sure there are people, that in the audience now that can resonate with this notion of negative self-talk. It's something I do that, we all do it in certain situations. What would you suggest as a resource to help with dealing with that?
Yeah, I'd say I honestly believe that mindfulness really helped me with negative self-talk, because you're suddenly becoming aware of what you're saying internally and going, oh gosh, what was that about? Let's change that. So just maintaining presence and really questioning your own negative self-talk, and getting into that habit of questioning and that. So yeah, I would say mindfulness.
I'd agree with that one as well. Thank you. Okay, so another question here, and this is from Mo. A comment first, and thanking you all for a lovely presentation. How can we find confidence in the face of criticism when communicating our presentations? So Mo studied architecture, where it's a difficult field to overcome your own strongest saboteur. So I think what she's kind of saying is, like, when you're in the environment and there's a lot of criticism in that environment, how do you manage that? Some environments are just more critical than others. I should imagine the banking sector might be. Karen, you talked about the problems with the legal, the law sort of sector. So how do you kind of find confidence in environments that are inherently negative? And I'll ask, I would have asked Carl, but I can't see Carl just now, so maybe he'll come back in. So maybe Karen, because you've got some first-hand experience of that in the legal sector, how do you kind of manage that? I mean, one answer could be don't go there.
Well, I wouldn't say don't go there, not necessarily. I do caveat that, because I think we do have to make choices about going into spaces that are healthy for us. And sometimes we don't have the luxury of being able to exercise that choice because we've got a bill to pay or whatever. And you definitely see that with people that are trapped in negative and toxic workplaces, where they feel trapped, but they are not in the right place to be able to sell themselves to go somewhere else as well. So I would point people definitely the Amy Cuddy TED talk about fake it to make it to become it, because I think there is something really important about changing, as Natasha was saying, the way that we talk to ourselves, so that we are talking positively to ourselves. Again, Brene Brown's work is really good in this regard, around recognizing the stories that we tell ourselves and the way that we habitually look for evidence to back up the narratives. And those narratives are often the worst possible kind of emphasis of or version of the situation that you could possibly imagine. So I think there is something about that kind of recognizing, speaking kindly to ourselves, and then using those practical tools of confidence poses, power poses. But I go back to the 4 agreements. Don't make assumptions. Ask, check. Don't take things personally. All of those are really, really useful guide stars for us to be able to engage with a situation that's unhealthy, but also recognize that sometimes what makes you different and sets you apart is used against you, and it's used as a stick to beat you with. And I don't think we should buy into those kinds of narratives. I think we should be able to feel like we can call them out. And sometimes it's not about us being confident, it's about us challenging. And if you haven't got the confidence to challenge, and you haven't got the power or privilege to challenge, others that do have should be giving you their allyship and challenging it on your behalf, with you, alongside you, and strengthening and validating what you say.
Absolutely, and I completely concur with that. I had a conversation with some colleagues where I talked about the importance of allies for those moments, those times when I don't have the words, I don't have the courage, I don't have the energy to deal with something, but they can stand up for me. Allyship is so important on that journey. Thank you, Karen. So another question.
Sorry, my video cut out. I can't see video.
That's fine, Carl. That's okay. Thank you for coming back in. So a question from Hania, and she's asking, what's the best way to give someone you care about advice, especially about themselves, and in a good way, so as not to make them feel like an imposter? So I'm asking you that question, Carl. That's your punishment for dropping out. So what would you say is, what's the best way to give advice to someone, and doing it in a caring, a compassionate way, so that they don't end up feeling like an imposter?
How I do it is I share my experiences, because there's a lot of things, like I was saying, a lot of people today would have felt the same things. And once you can, you've got a shared consensus with someone, actually, it's almost like having empathy, so they can feel what you've been through, so it's not daunting. A lot of the times we give people advice and say, do this, do that, but we're not doing it ourselves. So I always try and, from my point of view, give a perspective which is almost like easy to follow. Like, there's a few books as well, which I didn't mention, which is I've bought for people. There's a book called Awareness by Anthony DeMello. Everyone should get that book, because it's like everyone I've given it to, it's almost like without me speaking, it opens up things in them where they can question themselves, and then it's easy to have a conversation, because no one don't want to hear that they're doing something wrong. A lot of people say, well, how can I do it? Tell me how to do it. But everything's different for everyone. You've got to give them, it's almost like give them a little bit of information where they can get from it, and then you can have a narrative and start a conversation off that. The times I have given people advice, it's been like, well, you said this and you said that, so I don't do that anymore. Just like, again, let people realize their own truths. I've got to be attuned to themselves. Everyone's different, but everyone's different in how they see things, but a lot of us have similarities. So
yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it very much does. And thank you for mentioning that resource as well. You say it's Anthony Meller, and it's Awareness.
Yeah, it's called Awareness. And there's also one by Susan Jeffers called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And Hazel M. Denning, Intuition. Those are my go-tos. Oh, yeah. And Eckhart Tolle, Stillness Speaks. That's it now. But yeah, those are good books, because again, you can pick them up at any time. And there will always be something in there.
Yeah, great. So there's so much material out there that we can refer to kind of help us together to make sense. There's a lot of sense making, I think, that we have to do when we're experiencing feelings of being an imposter, but there's so much material that we can use to help us on that process. So another question here, and I'm going to direct this one at you, Natasha, because you talked about things like trauma and so on. And this is sometimes an experience for people in childhood, right across their lifespan, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, could you think of people during your childhood, your youth, adulthood, or career that you feel have made your imposter syndrome worse? So I'm not necessarily expecting you to name and shame people here, but perhaps just in terms of, maybe the role that they may have played, and sometimes there are some significant figures in our lives that have contributed to the feelings of imposterism that we hold today.
Yeah, I mean, starting off from right at the start would be, parents, as mentioned earlier, that whole notion of feeling gratitude to any achievement or experiences that I have, in terms of education, whatever achievement I make. It's having gratitude first and foremost that I was taught by parents, but interestingly, it should be more, well, I've done this. I've got so far by doing this and working hard myself. So I'd say that fueled my first. I'd say they very much had a part to play, I'd say. And then going through schooling, it's going to perhaps a school where it was quite underprivileged. I went to school in Wembley, and actually you were pretty much talked at. Your opinions weren't often heard, and you're just given material and expected to learn. So again, experiences weren't really valued at high school. So I'd say it very much follows that same sort of that trajectory, because it then leads to fear of failure, and I guess that's where you tend to have a huge stem, as it were, in imposter syndrome, partly because of that fear of failure. So yeah, absolutely, it definitely stems from parents through to teachers in high school. But when I did come to, actually, it's I say all that and it sounds incredibly dreary, but when I did come to the University of Westminster, I also joined as a mature student, funny enough. I initially failed my degree, and then joined Westminster University after a couple of years after working, and it was there where I found a place in my undergrad. So I realized that's the route that I want to go down, and I'm still there. So it says something.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
So it actually speaks to the importance of those significant figures in our lives, and some of them can actually do a lot of damage if if the things that they say to us are not healthy, and are not there for development and for growth. And of course, that means, therefore, that all of us have a social responsibility to ensure that we don't become those people. Yeah, so we're not actually putting other people down as well. Did you want to come in on that, Carl?
I was going to say, yeah, what I found, and this is something what I experienced, and I started looking at it again, because a lot of the young people I work with, it's like they had issues with confidence. So what I found, especially coming from a Caribbean background and upbringing and all that, and I don't know if it's the same, maybe people can share. When kids are young and they're doing things, we're like, oh, it's so cute, look at them, they're so funny, they're always dancing, they're always singing. Now there comes a point where it's like, all right, stop now, you've got to quiet down now, all right, stop showing off. And we do it unconsciously because we want peace of mind or whatever, but we don't know the effect that's having on the young person. So when you take that away from them, that is their confidence that you're saying, all right, stop now. It used to be funny, but you're older now, stop. That can have an impact on them as well. So we need to be mindful of how we, speak about things like that, because that is having an impact on how these young people are developing, and they lack confidence and self-esteem. And that comes from somewhere. So again, it's like it can have an impact on you. Like it had I wouldn't say that had an impact on me, because I was always doing that. But in terms of school, getting kicked out of school, and then taking ages to get back into education, that had a big impact. So it can last longer if you're not aware. If that makes sense.
It certainly does. It certainly does. And it just gives a sense of how important, home environments can be. Is meant to be sort of a place that nurtures you, but they can also be the place that tears you down. So these are things that we need to also recognize. Okay, I'm going to move to, we've got a few more questions before we wrap up. So this question from Raven: how do you measure your improvements or track your progress when you manage or deal with imposter syndrome? And listening to this question, it just gave me an idea. I think I need an imposter syndrome app where you can kind of track and manage what's going on. So I'm hoping you can all hear me. Some people have disappeared off the screen, and I'm hoping this is nothing to do with my internet. but that question, I'm going to throw that out to anybody who wants to respond. So I'll just repeat the question. How do you measure your improvements or track your progress? How do you know that you're getting there, wherever there is, when you're trying to manage or deal with the imposter syndrome?
When you're no longer nervous to be in an environment, and I would say just something will come up. I had to read a script in Sunday school when I was about 8 or 9. Now I got stuck on a word, yeah, in front of the whole congregation, and I came off that stage and I sat down and I was so embarrassed that I never ever spoke in front of anyone again, yeah, until I went to uni, yeah. So we're talking something like 40 plus years. So when I stood up there, all that nerves and all that, and why I'm even saying that, even I was nervous doing it then, but one of my cousins passed away, so I was reading a scripture in the church just the other day in October. And only when I was sitting down the day after the funeral, I thought, I read a scripture in the church and I didn't stutter. It was almost like something what stopped me doing it. I went back to the place, where a different church of where it happened, and reading that scripture was almost like, wow, you've done it without even thinking. You know what I mean? So there's certain times where when you're aware of something, it can hold you back. But when you're in a moment and doing something, you're not even aware of it. So it's almost like just being, you know what I mean, within yourself, like understanding that, you know what, like that happened then, yeah, and what happened when you were young doesn't have to dictate, but you need people around you to support that and bring that out of you, because again, one wrong word from someone can set you back.
Yeah.
You know, it can make you reinforce and think, oh yeah, they were right, it's true, like blah, blah, blah. But one uplifting word can make you think, yeah, you know what, I can do this. So it's all about where you're at that moment in time.
Yeah. So you're a fantastic example of, you know, kind of tracking one's progress and knowing when you've gotten there. And somebody put, I think Hayden put a comment in the chat saying that you're a brilliant talker now, Carl. So, you know, that childhood experience, you have conquered whatever it was that inhibited you then to be the kind of flourishing adult that you are now. So I just wondered if anybody else had any kind of sort of ways of knowing when you've kind of gotten there, where I've overcome that feeling of imposterism. Is there something that kind of goes off in your head and you know, yes, I've done it? Is it a feeling? Is it just a kind of, is it intuitive? What is it? Natasha?
I definitely say it's intuitive, and it's also that feeling of calm. Things start happening, weird things, then goals are achieved, and you suddenly find yourself at a stage where you're not questioning every move you make. You're suddenly at ease. There's less noise, more focus, more drive. So I'd say that would be a great measure, because it definitely was a way for me to say, I saw it in my writing. Something like my writing showed consistency, it showed focus, I was more coherent. And I just wondered where on earth that was for the last, say 10 years.
Yeah.
Suddenly I could see it. So I'd say
Fantastic.
that.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
again, for our audience and for students, and you recognize when you are getting to these places where things are just coming together and you're doing really well. And as Karen would remind you, celebrate that. Really celebrate that. Thank you so much, Natasha. Okay, just a couple of more questions then before we wrap up. And this one's from Hannah. When looking at each of your experiences of imposter syndrome, would you say what caused it was more innate and down to perhaps personal insecurities, or was it rather due to external factors, or could you say it was a mixture of both? So was it kind of like the top down and the bottom up, coming together, and you just kind of get this explosion, or was it specifically one thing or the other? Karen?
And for me personally, I think it was a combination of things. And I'm whenever I think about this, I think if you watch a child that has a stable, healthy background, then you see joy and play and dance and song, as Carl was talking about earlier. And they only start to be conscious of themselves, self-conscious of themselves and self-limiting when the external factors start to come in. but you also see kids that seem to be almost nervous and shy and withdrawn from day dot. So I don't know whether it is external or internal, whether it's about nature or nurture. But for me personally, it was definitely a combination of the two. And I think if I could just sort of throw in a thought from the last conversation, which is there is Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Effective Leaders. He's got a thing around control, concern, and influence. And I know that for me, the more time I spend in the space of influence and control, i.e. focusing my time on things I can control or I can influence, and the less time I spend on the things that I can neither control nor influence, but that concern me, that for me is a really good measure for me in terms of how healthy and balanced my mind is and how I'm dealing with imposter syndrome. Because if I rapidly get to the things I can influence and control, as opposed to spend all my time worrying about the things that concern me, personal insecurities, then I know that I'm in a reasonably good place. I'm comfortable with the discomfort, if that makes sense.
Fantastic. It sounds like some sort of barometer that will tell you when you're kind of heading into a place of trying to, as you say, control the things that are uncontrollable, and then bringing yourself back to a place of moderation where you recognize those things that you can't, focusing on the things you can. Excellent response. Thank you. So our final question then for the evening is this. If someone, and thank you, Christopher, for posing this question. If someone experiences deep-rooted imposter syndrome throughout their life, can it be genetically inherited by their offspring? Now, a word of caution on this question. So if any of you have offspring, you know, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I've transmitted imposterism to them. I'm not quite sure that I've ever heard of it talked about in terms of a genetic, you know, something that can be inherited. But it's worthwhile thinking about, because, you know, the whole question of socialization is in here. And then Christopher follows with a similar question. Does this syndrome originate from within the family unit? So you might want to look at it in 2 ways. Is this about and it's the nature nurture thing as well, I suppose, to an extent. Is it genetically inherited on the one hand, and is it therefore, or is it something that's kind of from within the family? So, Carl.
Sorry, when that came up, I saw it and I thought that's interesting, because like me feeling how I feel, if I saw that in my kids, I would be like, listen, you need to deal with it and have a conversation, because I know what it is. So I wouldn't allow it to become something like that, even though after doing lots of that, imposter syndrome is a phenomenon, but I think it's also a myth now, after doing so much thinking and hearing that, because it goes back to how you feel about yourself in a particular moment. I've got like an imposter doing my notes for this. I sit in the cats every day doing notes thinking, I'm going to be talking about imposter. Who am I though? Why am I important? And so all these things were going on. So you always get that element of imposterism. And in terms of like the family, it goes back to that. If you've got a sports family and mum and dad are athletes, the son may want to be an athlete. He's going to follow what it is, but he may not want to be an athlete. Are they going to say, well, you're not good because you don't want to be an athlete? It's not. So I think it's not hereditary. I think it's more about people being aware of what it is. I mean, I don't think a lot of people, like I said, I only knew the term and I adopted it when I went to uni, but I've been living it my whole life. So I think a lot of people don't actually know what it is. They just find coping mechanisms and ways to manage it, which could have had an effect on their kids. But again, I don't think it's hereditary. It definitely ain't. But in terms of my challenges, I make sure that my nieces, nephews, the young people I work with, make sure that we can have a dialogue, create a narrative, even if not with me, with their kids.
Thank you. And I'm going to pose that question to each of you just to finish. So, Natasha, is it something you could transmit to your children, do you think?
Oh no, absolutely not. What can be transmitted is this. It's just like generational trauma. If you have a generation that has not healed or dealt with certain scenarios, that is then inflicted on the child. That child will then grow up to experience exactly what Carl's saying. So I'd say in terms of nurture, it's full nurture. It's exactly how you parent that child, embracing every individual aspects about them and ensuring that they are you build on their confidence. So I'd say definitely not genetic, but more of a nurturing, yeah, a nurturing aspect, definitely.
Thank you. And to you, Karen.
Yeah, I think I agree with what's been said so far, and I particularly was struck by something that Natasha was saying earlier on, because it really resonated with me about the kind of the parental inadvertent, unintentional harm that can be done when we allow our own guilt and shame and social expectations and social norms. You know, you should do this, you must do that, you're a failure if you don't do X, Y, and Z. I think all of those things, when we allow those to seep into our parenting, can either break cycles or they can make cycles. You know, so I think Carl's absolutely right. I go out of my way and I drive my kids absolutely insane with constant, now what's the story you're telling yourself? You know, and we talk a lot about how they feel and what they are trying to do and what their perceptions of themselves are. And we talk a lot about self-care. You know, I feel very strongly, if we don't look after and love ourselves, how on earth can we love and look after other people? You know, we have to see ourselves, truly see ourselves, and love it, all the bits, whether they're good or bad. You know, even the bad bits. So I do think there is something about seeing and breaking cycles.
Yeah, very good. Because the last thing we want is some sort of intergenerational transmission of trauma, you know, and we want sort of a healthy kind of population going forward. Now, our own alumni team have been busy kind of constructing some questions of their own. And I think it would be remiss of me to end the session by not asking at least one of those questions. And there are a couple of them for which I'm quite intrigued for an answer. So I'm just going to ask the last couple of questions here. So one question that they've posed is this. Do you think that the remote working that we've had to do as a result of the pandemic has had an effect on people's experience of the imposter syndrome? So I'll put that to Natasha. What do you think?
Wow. Yes, absolutely. I'd say that just the environment of speaking on something like Blackboard, where there's a lot of silence, there's a lot of focus on your own voice. You are really missing out on the behavioral cues. I've got your cue, Debs. I can just about see Karen's cue. Absolutely homes in on these sort of insecurities and these anxieties. So I feel that I've had to, over the last 2 years, get used to that, and that's taken some doing. But I would also say by getting used to something like this has allowed me to grow and learn and develop. So I think it's worked as a weird advantage.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So in our research, what we found students saying was working remotely actually had a moderating effect, a positive effect on their experience of imposterism, because they no longer felt that they were being evaluated in the same way that they feel when they're with their peers. So there was a kind of this distancing was a safety net for them, which is really interesting. But thank you so much for that, Natasha. And it can go either way, of course. The very last question that I'm going to pose is, and it's for all three of you. And I want you to just think about this for a second. And it's just going to demand a very short answer. And it's simply this. What, if we could coin the term, would be the opposite of imposter syndrome? Karen.
The opposite of imposter syndrome.
I'll turn to you first, Karen. So what would be the opposite of imposter syndrome? So we have synonyms and we have antonyms, and I'm asking for the antonym. I'm asking for not a similar word, but the complete contrast to the imposter syndrome. Because what we want to do here, if we can, is to shift the narrative. So
Yeah.
rather than people running around and saying, oh, it's my imposter, we actually want them to say, oh, it's my whatever is the positive version of that. What
Yeah.
would you say?
Yeah, I mean, when you ask the question, I immediately thought of one of my favourite phrases, which is the opposite of work is not play. Sorry, the opposite of play is not work; it's depression. The opposite of play is not work; it's depression. And I think it's the same sort of thing here. That for me, the opposite of imposter syndrome isn't something that looks like it might be opposite. It's actually about being in flow. So you don't feel an imposter when you know yourself and you're in flow. As soon as you shift from trying to battle against and fit in and shape yourself to others' expectations, that's when you feel an imposter. But as soon as you accept who you are and you lean into it and you celebrate it and you go with it, that's when you don't feel like an imposter. So that's not quite giving you the answer that you perhaps were expecting, but it just sprung to mind, that play and work thing.
Right. Reminds me very much of, is it Sheryl Sandberg? The idea of leaning in. So now you're actually leaning in rather than going in the opposite direction. A quick one word from you, Natasha.
I'd say instead of fake it to make it to make it. So
Okay.
embrace yourself, make it to make it. So
Right.
not necessarily feeling fake, but making it.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So it's the making it, and it's not a syndrome, it's the making it phenomenon.
Exactly.
And finally, the last word from you, Carl. What would be the opposite?
Being intrinsic.
You said it. You said it.
That's it.
Thank you. Absolutely. Lots of brilliant comments coming in here, and people thanking you left, right and centre for your comments. And it's for me now to say thank you to each of you. Carl, thank you so much. Natasha, the same, and Karen. You've been so insightful this afternoon and sharing your stories, sharing your experiences. And I got a sense of authenticity in the comments that you were making this afternoon. Sometimes, as you say, Carl, it takes courage to come into a space like this and start talking about something which is actually very personal to our experiences. But you've all done that so brilliantly this evening. I also want to thank some other people, obviously our audience. Thank you so much for the questions that you've posed as well this evening. We wouldn't have had such a brilliant discussion without them. And also, I want to thank the alumni team who has set up this talk and ensured that all the kind of technological platforming things are working brilliantly. So just to remind everyone that's attended this session that you will be getting a survey. In fact, the link has been put into the chat right now. Please complete the survey. And that will be also included in a follow-up email to all of our guests this evening. So a reminder that the next What It Takes event is on what it takes to manage your money. And I think that's a really topical thing to be talking about with budgets and with energy price hikes and so on. So What It Takes to Manage Your Money is on Thursday, the 24th of November. Book online for that now. And all that's left for me to say is, again, a huge thank you to our panel. You've been absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed talking to you this evening. Thanks again to everyone, and have a good evening.